Sir, when legends walked, ancient creatures in the human imagination. Hello there, and welcome to Science for Sleep, where the questions are vast, the answers are gentle, and science takes its time like a tide rolling quietly to shore. Tonight, we're going somewhere ancient, not dusty or forgotten, but alive still, in the way that stories never quite die. A world populated not by people alone, but by creatures that walked the boundaries between earth and imagination, between what was seen and what was feared. Tonight, we're wandering into the realm of mythical creatures, or rather, wondering why, across every culture and every century, humans have filled their nights with the same impossible beasts. Dragons that breathe fire, wolves that walk on two legs under the full moon, horned horses that cannot be tamed, lions with eagle wings guarding mountains of gold, birds that burn and are born again from their own ashes. It's curious, isn't it? We are separated by oceans and languages, by thousands of years and thousands of miles. And yet, somehow, we all dream the same monsters, the same guardians, the same symbols. So I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? And what stories were you told as a child about things that lurked in the darkness, or flew through impossible skies, or died and lived again? Every culture has them. Every grandmother's warning, every campfire tale, every temple carving worn smooth by 1,000 years of hands reaching out to touch mystery made stone. If this gentle drift through wonder helps you rest, if it calms your mind or gives your thoughts something soft to hold, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd like the video or subscribe to this sleepy little corner of science. It helps others find their way here too, to rest, to learn, or just to float for a while. Now, I do hope this journey doesn't stir up so much curiosity that it keeps you wide awake. But if it does, well, you'll be in good company with werewolves howling at distant moons, dragons coiled around mountains of gold, unicorns stepping through forests that exist only in memory, griffins wheeling through ancient skies, and phoenixes rising from flames that never quite go out. So, settle in, let your shoulders soften, take a long, slow breath, and let's begin. Because somewhere between history and imagination lies the quiet story of why we needed these creatures to exist. Weissacher Part 1, The Beast Within. Have you ever wondered why certain images appear everywhere? Not just in one story, one culture, one time, but across the entire span of human civilization. The werewolf, for instance. This creature of transformation, this walking boundary between human and animal, between control and chaos. The werewolf first surfaces in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written somewhere between 2,000 and 700 years before the Common Era. That's among the oldest written stories we have. Already then, humans were imagining the goddess Ishtar, transforming a shepherd into a wolf after she tired of his affections. Already then, we understood that transformation could be punishment, that becoming animal was a kind of curse, that the line between human and beast was thinner than we like to admit. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, documented accounts of the Neuri, a nomadic people living north of Scythia, who supposedly transformed into wolves for several days each year. Herodotus himself was skeptical. He added that he didn't believe the story, though the locals swore it was true. Isn't that interesting? Even then, even in the childhood of recorded history, there was this tension between what people claimed to witness and what seemed possible, between folklore and fact, between what we saw and what we feared seeing. The ancient Greeks had origin stories too, of course. The tale of King Lycaon, who ruled Arcadia and made the mistake of angering Zeus. The accounts vary. In some versions, Lycaon served Zeus a meal made from human flesh, testing whether the god was truly omniscient. In others, he sacrificed a child on the altar of Zeus Lycaeus. The punishment was the same: transformation into a wolf. Lycaon's name gave us the word lycanthropy, literally wolf man, the medical term for the delusion of believing oneself to be an animal. The gap between the mythological and the psychological, right there in a single word. But here's what's haunting. The Greeks didn't just tell one werewolf story. They told many. Pausanias wrote of Demarchus of Parasia, who tasted the entrails of a human child sacrificed to Zeus and was transformed into a wolf for 10 years. Pliny the Elder recorded that in Arcadia, once a year, a man was chosen by lot, led to a marsh, hung his clothes on an oak tree, swam across the water, and transformed into a wolf for 9 years. If he refrained from eating human flesh during that time, he could return, swim back across the marsh, and become human again, though 9 years older in appearance. There's something primal about the werewolf, isn't there? Not quite human, not quite beast. Standing right at that uncomfortable threshold where civilization meets wildness. Where the part of us that lives in houses with locks on the doors meets the part that still remembers sleeping under stars, vulnerable to everything that moved in the darkness. By the Middle Ages, werewolf lore had spread throughout Europe, splitting into distinct regional traditions. In Germanic regions, the werewolf became deeply associated with witchcraft and dark magic. Men and women were accused not just of practicing sorcery, but of donning wolf skins or using magical salves to transform themselves into beasts. The trials that followed were brutal. In 1589, Peter Stube, also known as Peter Stump, was tried and executed in Germany for claiming to possess a magic belt that transformed him into a wolf. Under torture, he confessed to killing and eating numerous people. His execution was so horrific that it was recorded in woodcuts that circulated throughout Europe, cementing the werewolf in popular imagination as something truly evil. Meanwhile, in Slavic traditions, the werewolf took a different form. It became intertwined with vampire folklore, creating the Viol-Kolak or Vukadlak, a creature that was both werewolf and undead. In Serbian folklore, these beings would gather annually in winter, strip off their wolf skins, hang them from trees, then steal another's skin and burn it, releasing that werewolf from its curse. It's a strange image, isn't it? Werewolves gathering like some sort of support group, trying to save each other from their own nature. In Hungarian folklore, the werewolf ability was said to be obtained in childhood, either through parental abuse or curse, and the transformation occurred during the winter solstice, Easter, and the full moon. The Romanian Zmiu and the Polish Smok carried similar attributes, creatures caught between human reason and animal instinct, appearing in times of darkness, representing something that civilization couldn't quite tame. But perhaps the most fascinating tradition comes from Latvia, from the trial of an 80-year-old man named Thys in 1692. Thys testified under oath that he and other werewolves were not servants of Satan, but hounds of God, warriors who descended into hell to battle witches and demons. They fought to protect the harvest, to keep the devil from stealing grain down to the underworld. For this remarkable testimony, for claiming that his werewolf transformation was holy rather than evil, Thys was sentenced to 10 lashes for idolatry and superstitious belief. A surprisingly light sentence, all things considered. Almost as if the judges didn't quite know what to make of a werewolf who claimed to serve God. The same creature, different fears, different meanings. a monster in Germany, a protector in Latvia, an undead horror in Serbia, all of them reflecting something about the culture that dreamed them, what they feared most, what they valued, what they believed about the thin line between human and animal. First Overstern, Part 2, The Great Serpents. And then there are dragons. Oh, the dragons. If werewolves represent the beast within us, dragons represent the beast beyond us. The ultimate challenge. The force of nature that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be tamed, can only be faced with courage or avoided with wisdom. Dragons appear everywhere. Everywhere. The Egyptian serpent Apep, dwelling in the underworld, attacking Ra's solar boat each night, causing solar eclipses when it succeeded in swallowing the sun. The Hebrew Leviathan, described in the book of Job as a creature so powerful that only God could defeat it, with scales like shields, breath of fire, and strength beyond comprehension. The Greek Hydra with its many heads, each one growing back when severed. Python, the serpent, killed by Apollo at Delphi. Ladon, the 100-headed dragon guarding the golden apples of the Hesperides. The Norse have Jörmungandr, the world serpent, so enormous it encircles all of Midgard with its body, holding its own tail in its mouth. When it releases that tail, Ragnarok begins, the end of all things. They have Nidhugr, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, slowly destroying the foundation of reality itself. They have Fafnir, the dwarf transformed by greed into a dragon, killed by the hero Sigurd, but not before poisoning him with dying breath and cursed gold. In Persia, there is Azidahaka, sometimes described with 3 heads, sometimes with numerous serpent heads sprouting from his shoulders, a creature of drought and destruction defeated by the hero Feridun. In Mesopotamia, there is Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the salt sea, sometimes depicted as a dragon or sea serpent, slain by Marduk in the creation of the world. The Aztecs worshipped Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The Hindu tell of Vritra, the serpent that held back the waters until slain by Indra. In countless Aboriginal Australian cultures, there are stories of rainbow serpents, creators and destroyers, dwelling in waterholes and bringing both life and death. Every civilization, it seems, needed its great serpent, its winged beast, its creature of unimaginable power. Scholars believe that dragon myths probably evolved independently in various regions: Europe, China, the Americas, perhaps Australia. Think about that for a moment. These cultures had no contact with each other. No traders carrying tales across oceans, no shared books or common languages, no internet, no global communication, no way to coordinate their dreams. And yet, somehow, they all imagined dragons. Why? One theory points to dinosaur bones. Ancient peoples digging in the earth, finding massive skulls with beaked jaws and long necks, bones bigger than any living creature they knew. What else would they think, except that monsters once walked here? Fossilized Protoceratops skeletons are common in the Gobi Desert, right along the ancient Silk Road trade routes. These beaked quadrupeds, with their large frills, could easily be interpreted as having wings when the bones were incomplete or eroded. The griffin, that creature with the body of a lion and head of an eagle, may have originated from similar fossil discoveries in the gold-rich mountains of Scythia. In China, where dragon lore is oldest and most detailed, fossils of large prehistoric creatures are remarkably common. To this day, fossil remains are called dragon bones in China and have been used in traditional medicine for thousands of years. The earth itself whispered stories to those who would listen. But there's another theory, darker and more primal. Perhaps dragons weren't inspired by bones, but by instinct, by the ancestral memory of the predators that once hunted our primate ancestors. Giant reptiles, birds of prey with talons that could crush skulls, big cats that attacked from trees, all the things that could kill us, compressed and combined into one ultimate nightmare. The dragon, a synthesis of every predator that ever made our ancestors look over their shoulders, climb higher in trees, huddle closer to fires. Anthropologist David E. Jones suggests that humans, like other primates, have inherited instinctive reactions to certain predator types: snakes, large cats, birds of prey. Studies show that approximately 39% of people have innate fears of snakes, even in regions where snakes are rare. This fear is especially prominent in children who have never encountered a snake. Perhaps the dragon is simply what happens when you take all those instinctive fears and create a creature that embodies them all. But here's what's beautiful and strange. Dragons weren't always villains. In European traditions, yes, dragons were monsters to be slain. Saint George killed the dragon to save the princess. Beowulf died killing the dragon that plagued his kingdom. Sigurd became a hero by driving his sword into Fafnir's soft underbelly. The dragon guarded treasure because it was greedy, cruel, a force of destruction that needed to be overcome. But in Chinese mythology, dragon kings were revered as controllers of weather and rain, particularly important for agriculture. These weren't monsters to be slain. They were divine beings, benevolent forces, bringers of life-giving water. The emperor of China was called the Son of the Dragon. Dragon imagery appeared on imperial robes, on palace walls, in artwork that celebrated power, wisdom, prosperity. To kill a dragon in Chinese tradition wouldn't make you a hero. It would make you a fool who destroyed something sacred. In Korean mythology, dragons are associated with water, living in rivers and oceans and deep mountain pools. Lady Aryong, the first queen of Silla, was said to have been born from a cockatrice. The grandmother of Taejo of Goryeo was reportedly the daughter of the Dragon King of the West Sea. King Munmu wished on his deathbed to become a dragon of the East Sea to protect his kingdom. Dragons weren't enemies. They were family. They were founders. They were guardians. In Japanese tradition, dragons could be appealed to or controlled. The samurai Minamoto no Mitsunaka dreamed of a beautiful woman who begged him to save her land from a giant serpent. When he woke, a seahorse stood before him. He rode it to a temple, prayed for 8 days, then confronted the serpent and killed it with a single arrow. This wasn't a story of a monster terrorizing the innocent. It was a story of balance being restored, of one power defeating another in the name of harmony. In Vietnamese culture, the dragon is the literal ancestor of the people. The creation myth tells of the dragon lord Lac Long Quan and the fairy Ao Ko, who bore 100 eggs. When they separated, Lac Long Quan brought 50 children to the sea, while Ao Ko brought the rest up the mountains. To this day, Vietnamese people describe themselves as children of the dragon, grandchildren of the fairy. The same beast, different fears, different dreams. A monster in England, a god in China, an ancestor in Vietnam, a force of nature in India. What does that tell us? Perhaps that the dragon was never really about the creature itself. It was always about what we needed it to represent. In Europe, where feudalism and Christianity shaped worldviews, the dragon represented chaos that needed to be overcome by heroic individuals. Knights, saints, warriors proving their worth. In Asia, where agricultural societies depended on monsoon rains and river flooding, the dragon represented the forces of nature that needed to be respected, honored, negotiated with, rather than defeated. The dragon is a mirror. It shows us what we value and what we fear. And looking at how different cultures imagine the same creature tells us more about those cultures than it does about dragons. Part 3. The impossible made pure. And what of the unicorn, that most delicate of impossible creatures? The unicorn feels different from werewolves and dragons, doesn't it? Less fearsome, more wistful, a creature of purity rather than power, of grace rather than terror. Medieval tapestries show it kneeling in a maiden's lap, gentle as a lamb, captured not by force but by innocence. But the earliest descriptions tell a different story. Ancient Greek writers described a creature called the monoxeros, the one-horned beast. Ctesias, a Greek physician at the Persian court in the 5th century BCE, wrote about wild asses in India, fleet of foot, having a horn a cubit and a half in length, colored white, red, and black. These creatures, he said, were so fierce and so fast that they could never be captured alive. Their meat was too bitter to eat, but their horns had magical properties. Aristotle mentioned 2 one-horned animals, the oryx, a type of antelope, and the Indian ass. He was likely following Ctesias' account, trying to make sense of travelers' tales from distant lands. Strabo wrote of one-horned horses with stag-like heads in the Caucasus. Pliny the Elder described the monoceros as having the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, the tail of a boar, and the body of a horse, with a single black horn projecting from its forehead, 2 cubits in length. He added that it made a deep lowing noise and was very fierce. These were not gentle creatures. These were not symbols of purity captured by virgins in gardens. These were dangerous, untamable wild animals that existed somewhere far away, in India or Ethiopia or the mysterious East. Places that Greek and Roman writers knew only through second-hand accounts and travelers' tales. What happened? How did the fierce monoceros become the gentle unicorn? Christianity happened. Symbolism happened. The need for metaphor happened. The medieval bestiary called physiologus, compiled in late antiquity, popularized an elaborate allegory. A unicorn, wild and untamable, could only be captured by a virgin. As soon as the unicorn saw her, it would lay its head in her lap and fall asleep. This image became foundational to medieval understanding of the unicorn. The virgin represented the Virgin Mary. The unicorn represented Christ. Divine, pure, impossible to capture by force, but willingly surrendering through love. The horn represented the unity of God and Christ, the single nature that was both human and divine. Suddenly, the unicorn was everywhere in religious art. Paintings of the Annunciation sometimes showed a unicorn in the background or even replacing the Holy Spirit as the symbol of divine intervention. The hunt of the unicorn tapestries, woven around 1500 in the Low Countries, show noblemen pursuing a unicorn with hounds, trapping it with the help of a maiden, appearing to kill it, and then, in the final, most famous panel, showing it alive again, chained to a pomegranate tree in a garden, surrounded by flowers. Scholars still debate the meaning. Is it a religious allegory for Christ's death and resurrection? Is it a secular celebration of marriage and fertility? Is it both, because in medieval thinking, those things weren't separate? The unicorn also acquired courtly meanings. In 13th century French literature, lovers described themselves as being drawn to their ladies, the way unicorns were drawn to virgins. The unicorn became a symbol of chaste love, faithful marriage, the beloved who could tame the wild heart. Petrarch's Triumph of Chastity featured a chariot drawn by unicorns. Marriage portraits showed unicorns as emblems of fidelity. By the Renaissance, Unicorn horns were among the most valuable objects in Europe. Except, of course, they weren't unicorn horns. They were narwhal tusks, sold by traders who obtained them in the North Atlantic. But the belief in their power was real. Unicorn horn, alicorn, was thought to purify poisoned water, cure disease, detect poison in food. Cups were carved from alicorn and given to kings as gifts. Powdered alicorn was sold as medicine well into the 18th century. The Danish physician Ole Worm finally determined in 1638 that these horns came from narwhals, not unicorns. But the trade continued anyway. Belief is more powerful than fact sometimes. There's something poignant about the unicorn. It represents not what we fear, but what we long for. Purity that still exists somewhere. Innocence that can survive. Wildness that can be gentled by love rather than conquered by force. Perhaps that's why it endures even now, when we know it never existed. We need it to exist. We need the idea that somewhere, in some garden just beyond our reach, there is still something perfect and untouched. Part 4. The Guardians of Gold. But let's not forget another creature that stalked the ancient imagination. The griffin. Part eagle, part lion, all guardian of treasure and mystery. The griffin is older than you might think. Images of griffin-like creatures appear in ancient Egypt as early as the 4th millennium BCE. That's over 6,000 years ago. Paintings and carvings show creatures with lion bodies and eagle heads, sometimes with wings, sometimes without, always powerful, always watchful. The Egyptians called them tesh-tesh, meaning terror in pieces. They weren't gentle creatures. They were predators, combining the king of beasts and the king of birds into one ultimate hunter. In ancient Persia and Mesopotamia, the griffin appears on cylinder seals, in palace carvings, pulling the chariots of gods or guarding sacred spaces. Bronze griffin protomes, decorative attachments for cauldrons, have been found throughout ancient Greece, particularly at religious sites like Olympia and Samos. These weren't just decorative. They were magical objects, protective symbols, representations of divine power. The ancient Greeks told specific stories about griffins. They lived in the far north, in the Riphean Mountains beyond Scythia, where they guarded vast deposits of gold. The one-eyed Arimaspians, nomadic people living in that region, constantly battled the griffins for access to the gold. The Greek poet Aristeas supposedly traveled to those lands in the 7th century BCE and brought back tales of the griffin-guarded treasures. Herodotus, ever skeptical, repeated these stories but noted they came from travelers' accounts, not personal observation. Still, the image stuck. Griffins and gold became inseparable. The creature that combined lion and eagle also combined earthly wealth with heavenly power, material treasure with divine protection. As Christianity spread, the griffin gained new symbolism. Like the dragon and the unicorn, it was absorbed into religious allegory. Some saw it as a symbol of Christ, combining the earthly nature, lion, with the divine nature, eagle. Others saw it as a symbol of the Pope or the Church itself, watchful, protective, powerful. Griffins appeared carved on churches, painted in manuscripts, woven into tapestries alongside religious scenes. In heraldry, the griffin became a symbol of strength, courage, leadership, vigilance. Noble families adopted it as their emblem. It appeared on shields and banners, in family crests passed down through generations. The griffin was always portrayed as fierce, always guarded, watchful, protecting what it valued. But here's what's interesting. Unlike dragons, griffins were rarely portrayed as evil. They weren't monsters to be slain, but guardians to be respected. They protected treasure not because they were greedy, but because they were loyal. They attacked intruders not because they were cruel, but because they were dutiful. In a world where most mythical beasts represented chaos or danger, the griffin represented order. Fierce order, perhaps, but order nonetheless. Some scholars believe the griffin legend may have originated from the same source as dragon myths, fossils. In the gold-rich mountains of Central Asia, where ancient peoples mined for precious metals, they would have encountered fossils of protoceratops and other beaked dinosaurs. These creatures had 4 legs, large heads with pronounced beaks, and frills that could be interpreted as wings or manes. To someone discovering these bones in a place associated with gold, the conclusion might seem obvious. Enormous beaked creatures guarded the gold deposits. Whether or not this theory is true, the griffin served a purpose. It explained why gold was hard to obtain, not because it was geologically rare or technically difficult to mine, but because powerful guardians protected it. It gave danger a face, a form, a nature that could be understood. And perhaps that's what all these creatures did. They gave us ways to understand a world that was often incomprehensible. Part 5. The Bird of Flames. And then there is the phoenix, the creature that cannot stay dead. Of all the mythical beasts, the phoenix might be the most symbolic, the least concrete. It's rarely described as attacking anyone or guarding anything or being captured by heroes. The phoenix simply exists in its cycle. Living, dying, being reborn. Living, dying, being reborn. Forever. The story appears first, as far as we know, in ancient Egypt. The Bennu bird was associated with the sun god Ra, with creation, with the flooding of the Nile, with the eternal cycles that governed Egyptian life. It was depicted as a gray or white heron, sometimes with 2 feathers on its head, standing on a sacred stone. The Bennu appeared at the beginning of each new age, at moments of renewal and rebirth. When Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, he recorded stories of a bird that the Egyptians called phoenix, though he was skeptical about some details. According to his account, the phoenix came to Egypt only once every 500 years, when the old phoenix died. It carried its father's body, encased in myrrh, from Arabia to the Temple of the Sun in Heliopolis, where it buried the body. Herodotus noted that this seemed unlikely, but he faithfully recorded what he was told. Later, Greek and Roman writers added details. Pliny the Elder described the phoenix as being the size of an eagle, with gold and red plumage, purple body, blue tail feathers with rose-colored tips, a crest, and a long lifespan. 500 or 1,000, or even over 12,000 years, depending on who was telling the story. When its time came, the phoenix would build a nest of cinnamon and frankincense, sing a beautiful song, and then ignite itself in flames. From the ashes, a new phoenix would emerge. The early Christians seized on this image. Here was the perfect symbol for resurrection, a creature that died and lived again, literally rising from its own ashes. The phoenix appeared in early Christian art, often with a halo, 7 rays of light like the sun. It appeared in medieval bestiaries as proof that resurrection was part of the natural order. If a bird could die and live again, why not Christ? Why not all of humanity? Dante used the phoenix in his Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, he writes, "Even thus by the great sages 'tis confessed the phoenix dies, and then is born again, when it approaches its 500th year." Shakespeare referenced it in Henry VIII. "Nor shall this peace sleep with her. But as when the bird of wonder dies, the maiden phoenix, her ashes new create another heir as great in admiration as herself." The phoenix became shorthand for any kind of renewal. Cities destroyed and rebuilt called themselves phoenixes. Organizations that reinvented themselves adopted the phoenix as symbol. Anyone who overcame tragedy or loss or defeat could claim kinship with the bird of flames. But why did this particular image resonate? Why did so many cultures develop similar concepts? The Feng Huang in China, the firebird in Slavic traditions, the Simurgh in Persian mythology, the Garuda in Hindu tradition, all birds associated with fire or sun or immortality or rebirth? Perhaps because the cycle of death and rebirth is universal. The sun sets and rises. Seasons turn. Plants die in winter and return in spring. The old die and children are born. Everything ends and begins in endless succession. The phoenix simply makes that cycle visible, dramatic, impossible to ignore. Or perhaps because we need to believe that death is not final, that endings are also beginnings, that loss contains the seeds of renewal, that from ashes, something can rise again. This might be the most fundamental human hope, older than any religion, deeper than any philosophy. The hope that nothing is truly lost, that everything can be reclaimed, that death itself might be not an ending, but a transformation. The phoenix promises that. Part 6. Why we dream them. So why do we create these creatures? Why do we need them? Here are some theories, though none of them fully explain the mystery. First, we dream them because we find things we don't understand. Fossils in mountains, bones of creatures that no longer exist, footprints too large to belong to any known animal. The world is full of physical mysteries, and our brains are built to create explanations. Dragons, griffins, phoenixes, these might be our ancestors' attempts to make sense of physical evidence they encountered but couldn't explain. Second, we dream them because we fear things we can't control. Predators in darkness, storms that destroy crops, diseases that transform people, death that comes without warning. These creatures externalize our fears, give them forms that can be understood, fought, negotiated with. A world with monsters is somehow easier to navigate than a world with random, meaningless danger. Third, we dream them because we need symbols. How do you talk about transformation without the werewolf? How do you represent divine power without the dragon? How do you illustrate purity without the unicorn? Protection without the griffin? Renewal without the phoenix? These creatures became shorthand for complex ideas that are difficult to express in literal terms. Fourth, we dream them because we need heroes. You can't be a hero without a monster to face. You can't prove courage without danger. You can't demonstrate worth without a test. These creatures provided the challenges that defined heroism, created the stories that taught values, gave people models for how to act in the face of the impossible. Fifth, we dream them because we understand, on some level, that we are them. We are the werewolf, capable of losing control, of becoming something we don't recognize. We are the dragon, hoarders of things we don't need, destructive when threatened, powerful when we choose to be. We are the unicorn, yearning for some perfect state we can never quite achieve. We are the griffin, guardians of what we value, fierce when necessary, loyal to what we protect. We are the phoenix, endlessly dying and being reborn, transformed by every loss, rising from every failure. These creatures are us, externalized, exaggerated, made mythic, but us nonetheless. Part 7. What they became. These creatures didn't stay static. They evolved, changed, meant different things in different eras. The werewolf went from ancient curse to medieval witchcraft to Victorian Gothic horror to modern metaphor for puberty, addiction, loss of control. In the Twilight series and similar works, werewolves became romantic figures, misunderstood protectors, symbols of wild loyalty rather than mindless savagery. Dragons went from universal threats to complex characters with motivations, relationships, moral codes. In Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, dragons are ancient, wise, speaking their own language of creation. In Anne McCaffrey's Pern, they bond telepathically with human riders, protecting humanity from existential threat. In How to Train Your Dragon, they're misunderstood animals that can become friends. Unicorns went from fierce, untamable beasts to Christian symbols, to courtly love emblems, to children's toys, to, most recently, symbols of queer identity and nonconformity. The rainbow-maned unicorn of modern imagery bears little resemblance to Pliny's description, but it serves modern needs the way the medieval unicorn served medieval needs. Griffins appear in countless fantasy worlds as mounts, guardians, symbols of noble houses. The phoenix became the symbol of resilience, of marginalized communities that survive despite attempts to destroy them, of anyone who has lost everything and rebuilt. These creatures shapeshift across time, taking on whatever meaning we need them to have. That's their real magic. Not that they can breathe fire or transform under the full moon or rise from ashes or be captured by virgins. Their real magic is their flexibility, their ability to mean whatever we need them to mean. Part 8. The real question. But here's the question that keeps me awake some nights. If we created these creatures to explain our world, to externalize our fears, to provide symbols and challenges and meanings, what does it say about us that we still need them? We live in an age of science. We know that fossils come from extinct animals, not dragons. We know that transformation myths arose from mental illness, rabies, hypertrichosis, not actual shape-shifting. We know that narwhal tusks aren't unicorn horns, and that no bird rises from its own ashes. We know all this, and yet, Harry Potter is one of the best-selling book series of all time, filled with griffins and phoenixes and werewolves. Game of Thrones captured global attention with its dragons. The film How to Train Your Dragon became a beloved franchise. Werewolf media, from Twilight to Teen Wolf to countless others, finds endless audiences. Unicorns are everywhere in popular culture, from Lisa Frank to the LGBTQ community, claiming them as symbols of uniqueness and pride. Why? Perhaps because science, for all its power and truth, doesn't provide everything humans need. It tells us how things work, but not what they mean. It explains mechanisms, but not metaphors. It gives us facts, but not stories. And we are story-making creatures. We always have been. Since humans first sat around fires, we've told each other stories to make sense of our experiences, to transmit values, to create shared meaning, to feel less alone in the vastness of existence. These creatures are part of that story-making. They persist not despite our knowledge, but because of our humanity. Because we understand that literal truth isn't the only kind of truth. Because we know that metaphor can be more powerful than fact. Because sometimes the best way to talk about transformation is to talk about werewolves. The best way to discuss guarding what we love is to discuss griffins. The best way to explore rebirth is to explore phoenixes. They're real, these creatures. Not in the way that dogs and birds are real, but real in the way that justice is real, that love is real, that hope is real. Real as ideas, real as symbols, real as shared stories that connect us across time and space and culture. First career, closing, in the Garden of Dreams. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I want you to imagine something. Imagine a garden that exists nowhere, a forest that cannot be mapped, a mountain that rises in no known range, a place where all these creatures still live, not as physical beings, but as possibilities, as meanings waiting to be claimed, as stories waiting to be told. In this place, werewolves run through moonlit forests, teaching us about our dual natures, our capacity for both civilization and wildness. Dragons coil around mountains, some hoarding treasure that represents greed, others bringing rain that represents blessing. Unicorns step through clearings, forever pure, forever free, forever just beyond our grasp. Griffins perch on high peaks, eternally vigilant, protecting what matters. Phoenixes burst into flame and rise again, 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 showing us that endings are always beginnings. These creatures wait there, not for us to find them. They can never be found because they never existed, but for us to need them, to dream them, to tell their stories to our children, who will tell them to theirs, who will change them and adapt them and make them mean new things we can't even imagine yet. Because that's what these creatures are. They're not relics of a more superstitious age. They're not embarrassing mistakes our ancestors made before science taught them better. They're living metaphors, evolving symbols, shapeshifters in the truest sense, changing their forms to fit whatever meanings we need them to carry. The werewolf that terrified medieval villages becomes the misunderstood outsider of modern stories. The dragon that demanded virgin sacrifices becomes the wise mentor or the loyal companion. The unicorn that only virgins could capture becomes the symbol of anyone who refuses to conform to what society expects. The griffin that guarded gold becomes the guardian of knowledge, of truth, of whatever we value most. The phoenix that rose from ashes becomes every person who has survived trauma, rebuilt after loss, transformed pain into strength. They change because we change, and they'll keep changing because we'll keep changing. Part 9. The ones we forgot. But let me tell you about some creatures we've lost along the way. Ones that didn't make the transition from ancient belief to modern symbol. Because that's part of this story too. Not just what survives, but what fades. The manticore, for instance. A Persian monster with a human face, lion's body, and scorpion's tail that could shoot poisonous spines. It appeared in medieval bestiaries, terrifying and strange. But it never found a place in modern imagination the way dragons did. It was too specific, perhaps. Too grotesque without being symbolic enough. It represented only danger, only otherness, without the deeper meanings that would let it evolve. The basilisk suffered a similar fate. In ancient and medieval accounts, it was a serpent whose gaze could kill, born when a rooster's egg was hatched by a snake. It appears in Harry Potter, briefly revived, but it never achieved the cultural persistence of the dragon or phoenix. Perhaps because its power, death by looking, was too absolute, too binary. There was no way to make it complex, no way to redeem it or befriend it or learn from it. The chimera, lion's head, goat's body, serpent's tail, breathing fire, appears in ancient Greek myths but rarely in modern stories. It was too much of a jumble, perhaps. Too many parts without a unifying theme. The griffin combined two noble animals and represented the best of both. The chimera combined three animals seemingly at random and represented only monstrosity. The amphisbaena, a serpent with a head at each end of its body. The catoblepas, whose gaze turned people to stone. The bonacon, which defended itself by spraying burning dung. The yale, a goat-like creature that could swivel its horns independently. These creatures filled medieval bestiaries, fascinated our ancestors, and then faded. We don't tell stories about them anymore. They don't appear on modern crests or in fantasy novels or in children's books. Why did some creatures persist while others disappeared? I think it's about adaptability. Not physical adaptability, these creatures never existed physically, but symbolic adaptability. The ones that survived were the ones that could mean more than one thing. That could be interpreted in multiple ways. That could shift their significance as human cultures shifted. The dragon could be evil or good, Eastern or Western, intelligent or bestial, literal or metaphorical. That flexibility kept it alive across millennia. The werewolf could represent curse or blessing, loss of control or embrace of nature, monster or misunderstood victim. That range kept it relevant. The unicorn could be fierce or gentle, real or allegorical, symbol of Christ or symbol of queerness. That fluidity let it survive. But the manticore was only ever a monster. The basilisk only ever meant death. The chimera only ever represented monstrosity. They couldn't evolve because they couldn't mean anything else. And so they faded, kept alive only by scholars and fantasy writers doing research, but not living in the popular imagination the way dragons and werewolves and unicorns still live. There's a lesson there, maybe, about what survives in human culture. It's not the most elaborate things or the most terrifying things or even the most ancient things. It's the things that can change meaning while staying recognizable. The things that are specific enough to be memorable but flexible enough to be reinterpreted. The things that each generation can make their own. Part 10. The new ones we're creating. And here's something fascinating. We're still creating mythical creatures, right now, in our time. The Slender Man emerged from internet forums in 2009. A tall, thin figure in a suit with tentacle-like arms and no face, who stalks children and drives people mad. Within a decade, it had spawned countless stories, video games, a major film, and tragically, real-world violence, when 2 girls attempted murder claiming Slender Man told them to. A modern myth, born not from ancient campfires, but from digital forums, spreading not through oral tradition, but through creepypasta and YouTube videos. The SCP Foundation creates an ever-expanding universe of contained anomalies, monsters, objects, phenomena that exist in a shared fictional world maintained by thousands of contributors. SCP-173, a statue that moves when you're not looking. SCP-682, an indestructible reptile that hates all life. SCP-9999, a friendly slime creature. These are becoming our modern mythology, complete with lore, rules, and endless retellings. Cryptids like Mothman, the Jersey Devil, the Chupacabra. Creatures reported by witnesses, investigated by enthusiasts, explained by skeptics, but persisting in popular culture regardless. They fill the same role that dragons and griffins once filled. Mysterious creatures in distant or unexplored places, threatening or benevolent, possibly real or possibly imaginary. We're still doing it. We're still creating impossible creatures to explain our world, express our fears, embody our ideas. The tools have changed. Now we use internet forums instead of campfires, video games instead of tapestries, films instead of illuminated manuscripts. But the impulse is the same, and these new creatures are evolving too. Slender Man has already spawned variations, the Rake, Siren Head, countless others. Each one slightly different, adapted to express slightly different fears. Fear of surveillance, fear of the uncanny, fear of the forest, fear of the internet itself, that vast realm we inhabit but don't fully understand. The SCP Foundation creatures multiply and shift and change with each contributor. their mythology by committee, folklore by wiki. But they serve the same function as any myth, trying to understand a world that's bigger and stranger than we can fully grasp. What will these creatures mean in 100 years? Will Slender Man become as iconic as the werewolf, adapting to express new fears in new eras? Will SCP-173 appear on coats of arms the way griffins do? Will scholars in 2025 write papers about the symbolism of Siren Head the way we write about the symbolism of the phoenix? Maybe. If they can evolve, if they can mean more than one thing, if future generations can make them their own. Learn. Part 11. What science took and gave back. Science killed many mysteries. We know now that fossils are from extinct animals, not proof of dragons. We know that hypertrichosis causes excessive hair growth, that rabies causes aggression and foaming at the mouth, that dissociative disorders cause people to believe they transform, but that no one actually becomes a wolf. We know narwhal tusks aren't unicorn horns. We know birds don't rise from their own ashes. We know griffins never guarded gold in distant mountains because griffins never existed at all. Science took away the literal truth of these creatures, but it gave us something else, the knowledge of why we created them. And that's almost more beautiful. We created them because our brains are pattern recognition machines. We see faces in clouds, animals in stars, monsters in shadows. We take disparate pieces of information and create unified theories. We find fossils and imagine the creatures they came from. We observe predators, combine them into super predators. We experience loss and imagine resurrection. We created them because we're social animals who transmit information through stories. And stories need characters. Abstract concepts are hard to remember and hard to share. But a dragon guarding gold, a werewolf transformed by the full moon, a phoenix rising from ashes, these images stick, they spread. They persist across generations because they're memorable in ways that pure abstraction isn't. We created them because we're meaning-making creatures. We don't just want to know what happened. We want to know what it means. Science can tell us that the sun rises because Earth rotates. But that doesn't satisfy the part of us that needs to know what sunrise means. The phoenix rising from ashes doesn't explain combustion or resurrection, but it gives us a way to talk about renewal, transformation, hope. So science didn't really kill these creatures. It just changed where they live. They no longer live in distant mountains or dark forests. They live in our stories, our symbols, our shared cultural imagination. And they're perhaps more powerful than they ever were when people believed they were literally real. Because now they can mean anything we need them to mean. Part 12. Personal mythologies. Here's something I think about often. We each have our own relationships with these creatures, our own mythologies built from the collective myth. Some people feel kinship with werewolves, the sense of dual nature, of transformation, of something wild contained within civilization's constraints. Others feel drawn to dragons, the power, the wisdom, the solitary nature, the hoarding of precious things, whether that's gold or knowledge or privacy. Some people see themselves in unicorns, rare, misunderstood, pure in some essential way, needing protection or offering healing. These aren't idle preferences. They're ways of understanding ourselves, ways of explaining to ourselves and others who we are, what we value, what we fear, what we hope to become. The queer community's adoption of the unicorn isn't random. Unicorns represent being one of a kind, existing outside normal categories, being magical precisely because of your difference. That resonates. It speaks to experience in ways that literal language sometimes can't. Fantasy fans who identify with dragons aren't just saying, "I like dragons." They're often saying something about their relationship with power, solitude, knowledge, transformation. About seeing themselves as separate from ordinary society, perhaps dangerous if threatened, but magnificent if understood. People who feel drawn to phoenixes are often people who've survived something: trauma, loss, addiction, illness. They're saying, "I have died and been reborn. I have burned and risen. I carry ashes in my past, but I am flying now." These creatures become part of our personal iconography. They appear in the art we create, the stories we write, the usernames we choose, the tattoos we get. They're not just characters in old myths. They're mirrors in which we see ourselves reflected. Verse 3, Part 13, Teaching Through Monsters. And we still use these creatures to teach, the way our ancestors did. Children's books are full of dragons, not to scare children, but to teach them about courage, about facing fears, about looking beneath surfaces. The dragon that seems scary might be lonely. The dragon that seems evil might be misunderstood. The dragon that hoards gold might just need a friend. These aren't the dragons that medieval knights slew. These are reformed dragons, rehabilitated dragons, dragons that serve modern pedagogical purposes. They teach children the lessons we want them to learn. Don't judge by appearances. Violence isn't always the answer. Understanding is better than destruction. Difference isn't danger. The werewolf in modern young adult fiction teaches about puberty, about the body changing in ways you can't control, about new urges and new powers and new dangers that come with growing up. It's a perfect metaphor for adolescence. Transformation you didn't ask for. Power that's hard to control. Isolation from those who don't understand what you're going through. The unicorn in children's stories teaches about gentleness, about treating vulnerable things with care, about the value of purity and innocence. But it also teaches that rare and special things exist, that there's magic in the world if you know how to look for it, that being different can be beautiful. We've domesticated these creatures, in a sense, made them safe for children, but we've also made them useful in ways they never were when they were just monsters to fear or beasts to slay. We've made them into teaching tools, therapeutic metaphors, bridges between generations. A parent reading "Where the Wild Things Are" to a child is doing what parents have done for millennia, using monsters to teach lessons, using fear to build courage, using imagination to help children understand reality. The specific creatures change, the masks differ, but the practice continues. Part 14. The dark side of belief, but we should also acknowledge. Belief in these creatures caused real harm. The werewolf trials of medieval Europe were brutal. People were tortured into confessing they could transform into wolves. They were executed, burned, beheaded, broken on wheels. Peter Stubba's execution in 1589 involved his flesh being torn from his bones with red-hot pincers, his limbs broken with wooden wheels, his head cut off, and his body burned to ashes. His daughter and mistress were also killed, all because of belief in werewolves. The witch trials, deeply intertwined with werewolf lore, killed tens of thousands of people, mostly women, mostly outsiders, mostly the powerless being, destroyed by the powerful using superstition as justification. Even unicorn belief caused harm. The trade in fake alicorn, narwhal tusks, and other animal horns sold as unicorn horns defrauded countless people who bought them at enormous cost, hoping for medicine or poison protection. Sick people consumed powdered alicorn instead of seeking real medical treatment. Kings carried alicorn cups to protect against poisoning, while assassins used other methods. Belief in magic prevented people from addressing real dangers. Dragon beliefs led explorers and colonizers to see unfamiliar animals, rhinoceros, large snakes, crocodiles, as monsters to be destroyed rather than creatures to be understood. Marco Polo saw rhinoceros in Southeast Asia and described them with disappointment as dragons that were uglier than expected, that could be captured, that weren't really magical at all. That failure of imagination, expecting dragons, seeing only animals, may have contributed to the exploitation and destruction that followed. And modern belief in cryptids, Bigfoot, Nessie, Mokele Mbembe, while generally harmless, sometimes funds pseudo-scientific expeditions, exploits indigenous communities whose lands are invaded by cryptid hunters, and occasionally leads to environmental destruction in the name of discovering creatures that don't exist. Belief in the impossible isn't always innocent. Sometimes it's used to justify real violence. Sometimes it prevents people from addressing real problems with real solutions. Sometimes it turns the strange and unfamiliar into enemies, to be destroyed, rather than mysteries to be understood. We can love these creatures, appreciate their symbolic power, value the stories they enable, while also acknowledging that literal belief in them caused suffering. That's part of the story too. The dark side of mythology. The harm that comes when metaphor is mistaken for reality, when symbol becomes justification for violence. Part 15. The creatures we need now. So what creatures do we need now? In this particular moment, in this particular age? We need creatures that teach us about climate change. Perhaps not dragons hoarding gold, but dragons hoarding habitable land, or phoenixes that rise from ashes but burn hotter each time, or werewolves that represent humanity's divided nature, half civilized and half destructive. We need creatures that teach us about technology. Perhaps not griffins guarding treasure, but creatures that guard data or AI that appears benevolent but might be dangerous. Or digital entities that can't be killed because they exist as information rather than matter. We need creatures that teach us about pandemic, disease that transforms people, monsters born from infection, creatures that spread invisibly until it's too late. We've seen these emerging. Zombie fiction exploded in popularity, and zombies are essentially modern plague monsters, teaching us about contagion, about social collapse, about what happens when human beings become threats to each other. We need creatures that teach us about surveillance, watching eyes, omnipresent observers, monsters that see everything. Slender Man fills this role somewhat. SCP-173 that moves when you're not looking. The Weeping Angels from Doctor Who. Creatures that punish observation or use observation as power. We need creatures that teach us about isolation and connection in a digital age. Beings that exist only online, that touch us through screens, that are intimate but not physical. We're starting to see these. Internet ghosts, digital demons, viruses that are both software and mythology. We need creatures that teach us about identity in an age of increasing fluidity. Shapeshifters not as curses, but as expressions of self-determination. Creatures that choose their forms rather than being locked into them. Beings that reject binary categories. Every age creates the creatures it needs. Medieval Europe, obsessed with sin and redemption, created werewolves that represented damnation and unicorns that represented salvation. Ancient Greece, building empire and celebrating heroes, created monsters for those heroes to overcome. Victorian England, grappling with industrialization and imperial guilt, created Gothic monsters that represented the revenge of what civilization tried to repress. What creatures will we create? What forms will they take? What fears will they embody? What hopes will they represent? I don't know yet. They're still emerging, still taking shape in internet forums, in video games, in independent films, in collaborative fiction projects. They're not fully formed yet, but they're coming. They're always coming, because we need them. We've always needed them. We'll always need them. Werewolves, Part 16. The Eternal Return in Mythology. And so we circle back to where we began. Dragons and werewolves and unicorns and griffins and phoenixes aren't relics. They're companions. They've walked beside humanity for thousands of years, changing forms but never leaving. They'll walk beside us for thousands more, adapting to whatever we need them to be. They're older than nations, older than religions, older than agriculture maybe. Born when humans first sat around fires and tried to understand why we're afraid of the dark, why we dream of flying, why we long for transformation, why we hoard what we have, why we believe in renewal. They'll outlive us. Even if humanity ends tomorrow. Even if we destroy ourselves with climate change or nuclear war or AI or pandemic or any of the 1,000 ways we might fail. These creatures will persist, carved in stone on buildings that will stand for centuries, written in books that will be discovered by whatever comes after us, embedded in art that will long outlast its creators. And if something intelligent does come after us, machines or dolphins or ravens or something we can't imagine, they might find our dragons and wonder what we meant by them. They might discover our unicorns and try to understand what purity meant to us. They might see our phoenixes and realize we knew we were destroying ourselves, but hoped we might rise again. These creatures are messages, encoded meaning, symbolic language written not in words, but in wings and horns and fire and transformation. They're how we try to communicate across time, across cultures, across the vast gaps that separate one consciousness from another. And they work. They've worked for thousands of years. A Mesopotamian seeing a griffin and a modern person seeing a griffin are separated by 5,000 years of history. By languages that don't translate, by cultures that have nothing in common except the fact that both are human. But they both see the griffin and understand. Powerful, protective, combining earth and sky, guardian of something precious. That's remarkable. That's beautiful. That's worth preserving. Closing. In the Garden of Dreams, reprise. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I want you to visit that garden again. That impossible place where all these creatures still live. See the werewolf at the edge of the trees, neither human nor wolf, but perfectly balanced between. It looks at you not with hunger, but with recognition. It knows about dual natures. It knows about transformation. It knows about the beast you keep leashed inside you. It nods, turns, and disappears into shadows. See the dragon coiled around the mountain, scales catching starlight. It raises its head, slowly because dragons are never hasty, and regards you with eyes older than civilization. It has seen empires rise and fall. It has watched humans build and destroy and build again. It knows something you don't, something it can't teach in words. But by existing, by enduring, it teaches anyway. See the unicorn in a clearing, white as moonlight, horns spiraling up toward stars. It doesn't run from you. It stays perfectly still, perfectly gentle. It represents something you thought was lost. Innocence, purity, magic, hope. It's been here all along. It will be here still when you wake. You just have to remember to look for it. See the griffin on a peak, wings folded, eternally watchful. It guards something precious. Maybe gold. Maybe knowledge. Maybe the garden itself. This place where impossible things are real. It doesn't challenge you. You're allowed to be here. But you're reminded that some things are worth protecting, that vigilance has value, that fierce loyalty is a virtue. See the phoenix in its nest of cinnamon and myrrh, flames beginning to rise. Watch it burn, watch it turn to ash. Wait for it, wait for it. And there, a spark in the ashes, a glow, a shape forming, wings unfurling, the phoenix rising, always rising, teaching its lesson wordlessly. Nothing ends that can't begin again. These creatures are waiting for you. They've been waiting. They'll continue waiting, because they exist in a time outside time, in a space that's nowhere and everywhere. They exist in every story ever told and every story yet to come. They exist in your imagination, which is the only place they've ever existed, which is the only place they need to exist. Visit them whenever you need to. When you need to remember your own dual nature. When you need to face something that seems impossible. When you need to recall that purity still exists somewhere. When you need to protect what you value. When you need to believe you can rise from ashes. They're there. They're always there. Waiting in that garden, in that forest, on that mountain, in those flames. And here's the secret. The thing I saved for last. You're one of them too. You who transform daily from sleeping to waking, from private to public, from who you are alone to who you are with others. You, the werewolf. You who have power you don't fully understand. Knowledge you've hoarded, fears you guard like treasure. You, the dragon. You who carry some essential quality that makes you rare, that makes you different, that makes you irreplaceable. You, the unicorn. You who protect what matters, who watch over what you value, who combine strength with purpose. You, the griffin. You who have died and lived again in small ways and large, who have burned and risen, who carry ashes in your past but fly in your present. You, the phoenix. You're not just visiting the garden. You live there. You've always lived there. These creatures aren't separate from you. They're reflections. They're aspects. They're the parts of yourself you've externalized so you could understand them, name them, make peace with them. So rest now. Dream well. And in your dreams, when you meet these creatures, and you will meet them because they're waiting. Remember, they know you. They've always known you. Because they are you. They've always been you. Just wearing different faces, just speaking in symbols, just trying to help you understand yourself in a world that's often confusing, often frightening, often beautiful beyond words. Sleep. The creatures are watching over you. The werewolf stands guard at the boundary between wild and tame. The dragon coils around your mountains of memory and meaning. The unicorn grazes in gardens of hope you thought you'd lost. The griffin protects the treasures of your heart. The phoenix tends the fire that will transform you while you sleep. You're safe. You're loved. You're part of the oldest story humanity knows. The story of impossible creatures that help us understand what it means to be human. Good night. Rest well in the garden of dreams. The creatures will be here in the morning.